The brutal Arizona sun beat down on Abigail Turner's fever-ravaged body as she collapsed against the rickety door of her small homestead shack. The year was 1876, and the promise of land and independence that had drawn her west now seemed like a cruel joke as typhoid fever gripped her with merciless intensity. "Water," she whispered, her cracked lips barely forming the word as she dragged herself toward the wooden bucket. Her fingers trembled as she dipped the ladle, most of the precious liquid spilling before it reached her parched mouth. The cabin spun around her as another wave of fever hit. Abigail had come west after losing her parents to influenza back in Boston. At 23, she had inherited enough to purchase this small plot 30 miles outside of Tucson. For 8 months, she had managed alone, growing vegetables, raising chickens, and occasionally trading with passing travelers. Her nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, an elderly couple who checked on her perhaps once a month. No one would find her in time. This realization settled over her like the thick blanket she desperately needed, but couldn't reach. Abigail curled onto the floor, her body shivering despite the oppressive heat. The typhoid had progressed quickly, striking her down 3 days ago. Now, delirious with fever and severely dehydrated, she knew death was coming for her. Outside, a dust cloud approached along the winding dirt trail that could hardly be called a road. Kieran Adams pulled his horse to a stop, wiping sweat from his brow. At 26, he had spent the last 8 years working cattle drives across the Southwest. Now, heading to Tucson with his saved earnings, he planned to start his own small ranch. Something about the silent homestead caught his attention. Chickens roamed freely, but the garden looked unattended. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cooking hour approaching. Kieran dismounted, approaching cautiously. "Hello," he called, receiving no answer. "Anyone home?" When no response came, he stepped onto the small porch. The door hung slightly ajar. "Madam, sir, I mean no trouble, just passing through." A weak moan from inside sent him rushing through the door. There on the rough plank floor lay a young woman, her chestnut hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, her simple cotton dress soaked through. "Madam," Kieran rushed to her side, kneeling beside her. Her skin burned against his calloused hand. "Can you hear me?" Abigail's eyelids fluttered, revealing fever-glazed hazel eyes. "Water," she managed again. Kieran spotted the bucket and quickly brought her a dipperful, gently raising her head to help her drink. "What happened? Are you alone here?" "Fever," she whispered, before her eyes rolled back and she lost consciousness again. Kieran assessed the situation quickly. She needed a doctor, and fast. The closest town with a physician would be Tucson, 30 miles in brutal heat, but if he didn't go, this woman would surely die. He carried Abigail to her bed, soaking a cloth in water to place on her forehead. He found her canteen and filled it, leaving it within her reach. After ensuring the chickens were secured and bringing in extra water, Kieran mounted his horse. "Hold on, miss," he said, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I'm getting help." Kieran rode as he'd never ridden before. His horse, Thunder, a sturdy Mustang he'd trained himself, responded to his urgency. The desert landscape blurred as they galloped toward Tucson, the sun mercilessly beating down. He knew pushing Thunder this hard in this heat was dangerous, but a woman's life hung in the balance. 4 hours later, Thunder was lathered with sweat when they reached Tucson's outskirts. Kieran headed straight for the doctor's office, nearly falling from the saddle as he dismounted. Dr. James Morgan was just closing his practice for the day when Kieran burst through the door. "Doctor, there's a woman dying of fever in a homestead about 30 miles northeast," Kieran gasped, his throat raw from dust and exertion. Dr. Morgan frowned. "That would be the Turner place, Miss Abigail." "I didn't get her name, but she's all alone. Typhoid, I think. She needs help immediately." The doctor sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. 30 miles is a long journey, young man, and I have patients here who need me." Kieran stepped forward, determination hardening his features. "She'll die without help, doctor. I'll pay whatever it costs, doctor." Morgan studied the exhausted cowboy. Your horse looks ready to collapse. Mine isn't much better. The journey would take hours and we'd arrive well after dark. Then I'll find fresh horses, Kieran insisted. Please, doctor, I can't let her die alone out there. Something in his voice must have convinced the physician. Very well. Let me gather my supplies. Meet me at the livery stable in 20 minutes with fresh horses. Kieran nodded, already heading out the door. At the livery, he spent nearly all his savings on 2 strong horses. When the doctor arrived with his medical bag, Kieran was already saddled and ready. Here's some dried beef and hardtack, the doctor said, handing over a small package. Eat as we ride. You look ready to fall over. They set out immediately, pushing the fresh horses as much as they dared. Kieran led the way, retracing his path as darkness fell over the desert. How did you find her? Dr. Morgan asked as they rode side by side through a relatively flat stretch. Just chance, Kieran replied, his eyes constantly scanning the darkening horizon. I was passing by and something didn't seem right. Good thing I stopped. Indeed, the doctor nodded. Miss Turner is a remarkable young woman, came out here all alone after losing her family back east, proud though too proud to accept much help from neighbors. The night grew cold as desert nights do, but Kieran barely noticed. His thoughts remained with the woman fighting for her life in that lonely shack. Something about her vulnerability and yet obvious determination to survive alone out here had stirred something in him. They rode through the night, stopping only briefly to rest the horses. As dawn broke, Kieran spotted the small homestead in the distance. There, he pointed, urging his mount forward with renewed energy. They arrived to find Abigail still unconscious, her breathing shallow, her skin burning hotter than before. The doctor went to work immediately, examining her while Kieran fetched fresh water and stoked the fire. Typhoid, as you suspected, Dr. Morgan confirmed grimly. She's very ill. We need to bring the fever down and get fluids into her. For the next 3 days, Kieran barely slept. He followed the doctor's instructions meticulously, bathing Abigail's fevered body with cool cloths, spooning broth and water between her parched lips, and keeping the small cabin clean. Doctor Morgan taught him how to prepare willow bark tea for the fever and charcoal for the intestinal symptoms. On the 4th morning, Kieran was dozing in a chair beside Abigail's bed when he heard a soft sound. Opening his eyes, he found her looking at him, her gaze clear for the first time. You stayed, she whispered. Kieran moved to her side, helping her sip water. Of course I stayed. The doctor, resting in your lean-to, he's been here the whole time too. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. Why would you do this for a stranger? Kieran gently wiped a tear from her cheek. I couldn't just leave you. Dr. Morgan entered, his face brightening when he saw his patient awake. Well now, Miss Turner, you've given us quite a scare. Thank you, doctor, she said weakly. Don't thank me, Dr. Morgan replied, checking her pulse. This young man rode harder than I've ever seen anyone ride to fetch me. Then he's barely left your side for 3 days. Your fever broke during the night, that's good progress. Abigail's gaze returned to Kieran, seeing him properly for the first time. His dark hair was rumpled, his face showed several days' growth of beard, and his blue eyes were bloodshot from lack of sleep. Yet to her, he looked like salvation itself. I don't even know your name, she whispered. Kieran Adams, madam. Abigail Turner, thank you, Mr. Adams. Just Kieran, please. As Abigail recovered over the next week, Dr. Morgan finally returned to Tucson, satisfied his patient would survive with proper care. Kieran remained, tending to Abigail's homestead needs, fixing the leaky roof, caring for her chickens, and working her neglected garden. You don't have to stay, Abigail told him one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset paint the desert in fiery hues. She was still weak but improving daily. I'm sure you have somewhere to be. Kieran shook his head. Nowhere particular. I was heading to Tucson to look for ranch work. What were you before that? Bit of everything. Mostly a drover, moving cattle from Texas to Kansas, sometimes farther, saved every penny I could. Abigail studied him in the fading light. Why did you stop here that day? Kieran considered the question. Something just didn't feel right. The place seemed abandoned, but not abandoned. I'm glad I listened to that feeling. Their conversations continued each evening. Kieran learned how Abigail had come west after losing her parents, determined to build her own life rather than marry one of her father's business associates as expected. Abigail discovered that Kieran had lost his family young, raised mostly by an uncle who taught him ranching before drinking himself to death. I want my own place, Kieran admitted. Land that's mine, cattle with my brand, something to build and pass on someday. That's why I came here too, Abigail said softly, to build something that was truly mine. As Abigail's strength returned, she began helping with small chores, often finding herself watching Kieran as he worked. There was something mesmerizing about the efficient way he moved, the gentleness in his hands whether he was handling a chicken or repairing her front step. One morning, Kieran announced, I should be heading on to Tucson soon. You're well enough now. Abigail felt her heart sink unexpectedly. Yes, I suppose I am. That night, unable to sleep, she found Kieran sitting outside staring at the stars. Couldn't sleep either, he asked as she settled beside him on the porch step. I've been thinking, she said. This land I have more than I can work alone. 160 acres, most of it untouched. Kieran turned to face her. You said you wanted land of your own, she continued. What if you stayed, as a partner, we could build something here together? In the moonlight, she couldn't read his expression. A business partnership, you mean? Perhaps to start, she said, her heart pounding. I've come to value your company, Kieran, more than I expected to. He was silent so long that Abigail began to regret her boldness, then his hand found hers in the darkness. I'd be honored, he said softly. But I want to be clear about something. I find myself thinking about you in ways that go beyond partnership or friendship. Abigail's breath caught. Is that so? It is. And if that makes my staying inappropriate, she silenced him by squeezing his hand. It doesn't, not at all. The following week saw them working side by side to improve the homestead. Kieran rode to Tucson and returned with seeds, tools, and 2 young calves, the beginning of their herd. Together they built a proper corral and expanded the garden. In the evenings, they would sit together, planning their future. Their first kiss came after a summer thunderstorm had soaked them both as they rushed to secure the animals. Laughing and dripping, they had stumbled into the cabin, and Kieran had reached to brush a wet strand of hair from Abigail's face. Their eyes had met, laughter fading into something deeper, more meaningful. When his lips touched hers, Abigail felt as though everything in her life had been leading to this moment. I never expected you, she whispered against his mouth. A guardian angel in dusty boots. I'm no angel, he responded with a small smile, just a man who couldn't ride past. As summer turned to fall, their relationship deepened. They worked hard during the day and found comfort in each other's arms at night. Kieran built a small but sturdy cabin a respectable distance from Abigail's, though they both knew it was merely for appearance's sake when neighbors visited. Word had spread about the cowboy who had ridden nearly to death to save Abigail Turner, and their neighbors scattered though they began to visit more frequently. Most approved of the match, seeing the obvious devotion between them. One crisp October morning, Kieran took Abigail to a rise overlooking their land. The desert stretched before them, beautiful in its harsh way with their growing homestead nestled against the backdrop of distant mountains. I've been thinking, he said, taking her hands in his. I know we've only known each other a few months, but I feel like I've been waiting for you my whole life. Abigail's heart swelled. I feel the same. Then marry me, he said simply. Be my wife, let's make this place our legacy together. Tears filled her eyes as she nodded. Yes. 1,000 times yes. They were married in Tucson in November, with Dr. Morgan serving as Kieran's best man and the doctor's wife standing up for Abigail. It was a simple ceremony, but to Abigail, it was perfect. That winter proved harsh, with cold winds sweeping across the desert and occasional snow dusting the ground. Inside their small home, now expanded with Kieran's skilled carpentry, they found warmth in each other. "You ever regret it?" Abigail asked one night as they lay together, the wind howling outside. Stopping that day, staying, Kieran pulled her closer. "Not for a single moment. Finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me." Spring brought new life to their homestead. Their small herd of cattle had grown, and Abigail's garden flourished. They had added chickens, goats, and even a milk cow. The hard work was paying off, their dream taking shape day by day, and then came more news of new life. "Kieran," Abigail said one evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset, "I have something to tell you." He turned to her, eyebrows raised in question. "We're going to have a baby," she said, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "In the fall." The joy that spread across his face was something she would remember forever. He gathered her in his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "A family," he whispered against her hair. "Our family." The pregnancy progressed well through the summer months. Kieran grew increasingly protective, insisting on handling more of the physical work despite Abigail's protests that she was perfectly capable. "I almost lost you once," he would say. "I'm not taking any chances." As her body changed, Abigail sometimes found herself remembering those fever-racked days when she had been certain death was coming for her. How different her life had become because a kind-hearted cowboy had noticed something amiss and stopped to check. "In September, Doctor." Morgan rode out to stay with them as Abigail's time approached. The birth was difficult but successful, and when Kieran held his daughter for the first time, tears streamed unashamedly down his face. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the infant's tiny fingers. "What shall we name her?" Abigail smiled tiredly. "Hope, because that's what you brought me when you rode into my life." The years passed, bringing both joys and hardships. Their ranch prospered, eventually growing to include a substantial herd of cattle and one of the most productive farms in the territory. Hope was joined by two brothers, Daniel and Joseph, and a sister, Elizabeth. When Arizona gained statehood in 1912, Kieran and Abigail stood together on their porch, now part of a sprawling ranch house, and watched the celebrations in the distance. "We helped build this state," Kieran said proudly, his arm around his wife's waist. His hair had grayed at the temples and lines mapped his face, but to Abigail, he was as handsome as the day he'd first ridden into her life. "We built our dream," she corrected, leaning into him. At 59, she remained strong and vibrant, though typhoid had left her with occasional health issues throughout her life. Their children had grown, with Hope now married to a local rancher and expecting her third child. The boys worked the ranch alongside their father. While Elizabeth was away at college in California, something neither Kieran nor Abigail had ever imagined possible for their daughter. One evening, as they sat together watching another of the spectacular Arizona sunsets that had marked so many important moments in their lives, Abigail took Kieran's weathered hand in hers. "You remember telling me that finding me was the best thing that ever happened to you?" she asked. He nodded, squeezing her hand. "I remember everything about those days. I was thinking earlier about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped, if you had just ridden past like so many others must have done." Kieran was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't have ridden past. Something drew me to that cabin to you. Call it fate or God's hand, but I believe we were meant to find each other." Abigail leaned her head on his shoulder. "All those miles you rode, not stopping until you found the doctor, you saved my life." "And you gave mine meaning," he replied simply. Later that night, as they lay together in the bedroom they had shared for over 3 decades, Abigail traced the lines of her husband's face. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For stopping. For riding for the doctor. For staying." Kieran caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'll never stop riding for you, Abigail, not as long as I live." And he never did. Through 47 years of marriage, through droughts and floods, through births and deaths, through all the challenges that life in the ever-changing West brought them, Kieran Adams remained steadfast in his devotion to the woman he had found dying in a lonely shack. Their ranch became one of the most successful in Arizona, eventually encompassing thousands of acres. Their children and grandchildren carried on their legacy, always knowing the remarkable story of how it all began with a fever, a chance encounter, and a cowboy who wouldn't stop riding until he found help. On their 50th anniversary, surrounded by 4 generations of family, Kieran and Abigail stood once more on the rise where he had proposed. "Was it the life you imagined?" he asked, his voice now roughened with age. Abigail, her chestnut hair now silver but her hazel eyes still bright, smiled up at him. "It was better than anything I could have imagined. You were better. We built something good here," he said, looking out over their land, now dotted with windmills, barns, and the homes of their children. "We did," she agreed. "And it all started because you couldn't ride past a lonely shack." Kieran turned to her, taking her hands just as he had half a century before. "I love you, Abigail Adams. From that first moment when you opened your eyes and looked at me, I've loved you." "And I've loved you," she replied softly. "My cowboy who wouldn't stop riding." When Kieran passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, Abigail planted a tree on that same rise. 2 years later, when she joined him, their children buried them side by side beneath its growing branches, with a simple stone that read, "Kieran and Abigail Adams, who built a life from chance and courage." He rode for the doctor and didn't stop. She gave him a reason to stay. Travelers passing by the Adams Ranch in later years would often hear the story of its founders, of the young woman dying alone in a shack and the cowboy who saved her life. The story became something of a legend in those parts, a testament to the power of compassion, determination, and love. And on quiet evenings, when the desert wind blows just right, some say you can still hear the pounding of hooves, a cowboy riding endlessly through the night, refusing to stop until he finds help for the woman who would become his heart and home.